Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. I'm Samia Aziz, celebrating the power of literature and the voices of authors and changemakers from the global majority. Join me as we explore the stories that inspire, connect, and transform our world. Let's uncover the stories that truly matter together. In today's episode, I'm joined by the brilliant Chitra Nagarajan, a writer, researcher, and activist whose work spans human rights, conflict, migration, and climate justice. Chitra has spent many years working across West Africa, particularly in the Lake Chad Basin region, and brings a deep commitment to centering the voices of those often left unheard. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, Al Jazeera, openDemocracy, and more, and she is widely respected for her ability to weave together the personal, political, and historical with clarity and compassion. In this episode, we discuss her extraordinary new book, The World Was in Our Hands: Voices from the Boko Haram Conflict, which is a powerful and essential oral history project. Through a chorus of voices of survivors, fighters, community members, and aid workers, the book paints a deeply human and nuanced portrait of one of the most devastating conflicts of our time. It asks urgent questions about justice, memory, and healing, and it reminds us of the importance of listening deeply to the people most affected by violence. I'm so honored to share this conversation with you. It's moving, insightful, and necessary. Chitra, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's so wonderful to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have done an absolutely phenomenal piece of work with this book, The World Was in Our Hands: Voices from the Boko Haram Conflict. And I read it and I was just really in awe of it. And so, what it essentially is it's a collection of personal essays, interviews that have been transcribed, personal accounts from the region, from people that are impacted by the conflict going on in the region. And it's something that obviously often we know about, people are familiar with the name but don't really know the intricacies of what's going on. It's something that's not in the media as much as it was at one point, and even when it was, it felt like very sort of binary discussions about what was going on.
Mhm.
But I'd like you to just take me back a little bit. How did this book and the work that you've done, because I understand actually that it took years, because what we've got in this book is, I think, something like 42 or 45
Yeah.
personal accounts. But I understand that you did over 700 interviews over 5 or more years. Um, so, how did this book come about? What really motivated you to start this specific piece of work?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, and thank you for um, your reaction to the book. It's so nice, especially because the day that we're recording today is the publication day for the book.
Yeah.
So it's especially nice to talk to you today. So the book came about because I was working in the region. So I was born in my degree in Northeast Nigeria. Left as a child and then went back. And so I've been working kind of to analyze the conflict, build peace, and do human rights defense work since 2013. And I was having amazing, incredible conversations with activists, people who'd lived through the conflict. I was living and working in my degree and traveling all around Northeast Nigeria, and also had the opportunity to go to Nigeria's neighboring countries, Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. And the conflict has spilled over borders to affect those countries also. And yeah, in the course of my work, I was doing research work and talking to people and doing interviews, and telling friends about what I was hearing and what had happened, and just really just the things that people live through, which gives, I think, a fuller story and a fuller truth of not just this conflict, but I think also similar to other conflicts as well. Just yeah, like a complete picture of what happens, which often we don't get in the media narratives or the academic textbooks. And I felt a responsibility to let people know. I think because I was living and working in conflict zones for so long, it felt that people outside had no clue. Um,
Mm.
and I felt the weight of all of these people's stories, people who had trusted me with their life histories. Um, and in 2018, me and some friends had published a book called She Called Me Woman, Nigeria's Queer Women Speak, which is collecting the narratives of LGBTQ women in Nigeria. And I thought, why not do something similar for the conflict? So I didn't think about writing a book, I think, until about 2018 or so. But the first interview that I did, which ended up in a narrative in the book, was in December 2016, and the last was in in November 2021. So almost exactly 5 years. And since then, I've done more interviews. So I think I've probably done close to 900 now. Uh,
Wow.
but you have to stop writing a book at some point. So
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe we can go into this a little bit later, but having done so many interviews, when it came to writing the book, how did you decide what it was that you actually wanted to include? But also, how did you decide the format of the book? And then what were some of the I don't know, some of the questions that you had around which accounts you wanted to include and which ones you decided not to? What sort of informed that decision?
yes, so some of the narratives were really straightforward because yeah, their stories, the people's stories were so compelling that they deserve to be documented and told. So, for example, the first interview I did all those years ago in December 2016, it's about the woman who I spoke to. It's the last narrative in the book, if you remember. She hid 16 men in her house and then smuggled them to safety. I thought that was a very important story that needed to be told. And then also, once I decided to make it into a book, I also then asked friends and colleagues if they knew anyone whose story kind of really needed to be written down. And I went then and did interviews specifically for the book. Um, yeah, and also I think for me it was really important to have a diversity of experience and stories and people. Like it's impossible to be completely comprehensive, but at
Yeah.
least kind of have a snapshot of different lives and different life stories, both in terms of their relationship with the conflict. So in the book, we have stories of soldiers, of civilians, of community militia members, and also of people who were part of Boko Haram groups themselves, to have age diversity and gender diversity. So the youngest narrator is 18, and the oldest is in their 90s. Yeah, religious diversity, and also I felt that we know that there are certain stories and certain people who are written out of the archive. I really saw the process of collecting these narratives to publish in a book, not just as something um, that would be important for today, but also to form part of the archive of the future.
Yeah.
And that's why I really wanted stories that showed women's agency, men's vulnerability, the existence of gender diverse people and people of diverse sexual orientations, because these are the stories that are erased. And often we are told that women are a certain way and men are a certain way. And anybody who tries to challenge that, what you're doing is against our culture and our tradition. Um, and actually, I mean, my dream for this book really is for it still to be around in a couple of decades' time and to be a rebuttal to that.
Mm.
For people to say, but look at how our ancestors were living. You cannot say this is our tradition because this is not reflected in the historical record.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful because for so long, like you said, there's so much erasure, but there's also so much like minimizing. Like so many times in history, really actually significant effects concerning women or other marginalized groups are recorded just as footnotes. And it just like the history will just move on in the narrative,
Mm.
and it will have this tiny footnote that this woman did this massive life-saving expedition, but it will be a footnote.
Yes.
And it's so yeah, and it's so, I think, as you said, like powerful to reclaim that and to create that space in
Mhm.
a way that will hopefully be around for years and years and years to come.
Yes, because I think also, as someone who does look through the archive for stories and proof,
Mm,
there's often not so much there.
yeah.
And I was talking to historian Professor Garba Ibrahim of the University of My Degree a few weeks ago, and he was talking about how in the history of the region, women held so much power, political power, religious power, economic power, but how that's changed over the years and how that changed specifically during the period of colonization, because you had I mean, in the case of Nigeria, the British colonizers coming in and basically creating political structures on the ground. And what he said was they didn't look at how society actually was. They came with their own ideas around gender. And also, they listened to the ulama about how society was structured. And they had a very particular idea. And so, whereas in the past you had women who held powerful roles and you had specific titles for women, which were of more or less equal value to those of men, if you now look at the titles that are dormant, so many of those are women's titles because they got
Mm,
removed during this period of colonization. And
mm,
so in Northeast Nigeria, you still see women playing very powerful and important economic roles. So if you go to the market, it's usually women selling there. If you go to the fields, it's women, I mean, and men as well, but women play a very important role in agriculture. But when you look at the level of politics, there are hardly any women in the state houses of assembly. Not a single woman has been a governor in Northeast Nigeria. And you have a real exclusion of women from the political process, even though women still play very important roles in economic and social life. Um, but this is something that's not known. And so if you talk to anybody or most people in Northeast Nigeria, they talk about this is the way that it is, and it's unfortunate, and maybe we need to change that. But actually, this is not the history of the region. This is a very
mm,
recent history. And it's such a shame that we don't have stories that like the ones that are in the book from, 100, 200, 300, 500 years ago.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, and I think just a really important reminder to look at the past of what we see today and understand like the violence and the sort of brutality of colonialism combined with other things and the way that it has completely changed the world, and not for the better, I don't
Mm.
think. And so, yeah, I think it's really important to understand that. And so, you've said that you traveled across northeastern Nigeria, Cameroon, and Niger over several years, and obviously, like working on this book took a lot of that time. Um, how did you build trust with the people that you were speaking to and the communities? How did you make sure that they felt safe to share their stories and that they could really open up and tell you what
Mm.
they've been through?
Well, I was in a very lucky position in a way because I was working in these communities anyway, a lot of the
Mm,
times. So the people with whom I was speaking, either I had known them before I asked them for an interview, or they knew of me because I had been working maybe not directly with them, but with people who they knew.
mm,
Um, and I often was introduced to them through people who they trusted as well. Also, at the beginning of the conversation, I explained what it is that I was trying to do, and was very clear that there would be, unfortunately, no financial benefit to them from this. Um, but, that we were trying to record their story as part of letting people outside know what was happening and also for their descendants to know what was happening.
Mm.
People were really happy to talk. I think often, I think in conflict settings, often people who are around you have experienced their own pain and suffering so
Mhm.
much um, that you, it's very rare that you get the opportunity to sit down and talk to someone who will listen to you for 1, 2, 3 hours at a time. And I think also you build up trust through that process. So maybe people are a bit wary at the beginning, and then as you sit and you speak, or they speak and you listen, they get to trust you. And often, when I could, and it wasn't always possible, I went back to people if I was going to be in that place. And I have to say also, some of the places where I did interviews, it's not safe to drive there, like in the countryside.
Mm.
So I could only go back and talk to people if I was going to go back there for work anyway.
Mm.
Um, and if I could find them, I think so, unfortunately, given the reality of the situation, it could be that some of the people whose stories are in the book are no longer with us, that they've been killed or something else has happened to them. But when I could, I went back and I had their story, their narrative written up, and me and the people I was working with, the person that I was working with, would read it back to them in their language, so that they could listen, and they could change things. And often there they added, and so those additions also went then into their story. And honestly, like, these sessions were some of the most happy and joyous of the entire
Oh.
experience. People were so moved and touched that someone had taken the trouble to sit down and not just sit down and talk to them, but really accurately depict what they had said. Um, yeah, and I think also because a lot of the people whose stories are in the book, they are of a social and economic class where often they're not taken so seriously by others. And often they haven't had the opportunity to attend school or attend school beyond 1 or 2 years. Um, so I think there was also that dynamic of someone from outside the community coming and taking the trouble to come back, and treating people with respect and with dignity as well.
Yeah, that sounds so just like such a powerful experience. Just from the limited work I've done in the international development sector, I know that often people really want to tell their stories, but they can be cautious of the ways in which it can be manipulated or misrepresented, and how their sort of tone and body language changes as they realize that you're genuinely invested in the story that they have to tell,
Yes.
and you're not here to make money or to portray them in a negative light or further stereotypes about them that have been portrayed. And so, yeah, I think that sounds really, really impactful. But
Mm.
so many of the stories that you share in the book, there's a lot of trauma, and some of them are like very traumatic about things that, especially that have happened to women, um, when they've been taken away, some of the abuse that's taken place. Um, there's a lot of loss, so much loss throughout the book, and obviously, you do balance it, I think, also with with joy and love and resilience and hope. But just on the trauma side of things, in your role as the person conducting these interviews and putting this book together, how did you navigate managing that in sort of ensuring that in telling their stories, people were, I guess, like supported and that their trauma was not worsened in any way?
So my aim for this project was really to give people the opportunity to tell the stories of their lives on their own terms.
Mm,
And so, yes, I mean, I asked follow-up questions and clarifying questions, but whenever I started an interview,
mm,
and especially the interviews that I did, especially for the book, I didn't really have kind of a list of questions.
Mm.
I just asked people after we introduced ourselves, can you please just tell me the story of your life? It can
Mm.
take as short or as long a time as you want. And some people
Mm.
spoke for 5, 10 minutes, and other people, they started talking. And once they started talking, they didn't stop talking for about 45, 50 minutes, sometimes even an hour,
Wow.
because they wanted to tell these stories. As I said before, this is not necessarily something that they had done before.
Mm.
And many of them told me that the process of talking about what happened to them was cathartic for them.
Mm.
Um, I never asked them to talk specifically about trauma.
Mm.
So, for example, for women and girls who had been abducted by armed men and then forced into marriage, when they said, like I was married off to him, and then a few minutes later said, um, talked about giving birth, right?
Mm.
I mean, I didn't ask them to describe how they became pregnant.
Yeah.
When if they happen to mention something like he forced me, like I never asked them to describe their rape
Mhm.
because why?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the reader can judge what happened. And even if they can't, like that is not a reason for me to ask such questions.
Exactly.
Or when, for example, a man spoke about seeing the his father beheaded. I
Mm.
didn't ask him, "How did you feel?" Because I think it is, it's you can imagine how someone would feel in that setting, and even if you couldn't, that is not a reason for me to ask such questions.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of people actually, they said not only, I mean, not only was the process cathartic for them, but they talked about how their minds were kind of more at ease afterwards. Um, I think also if people were upset during the course of storytelling, of course, we gave them the opportunity to have breaks
Mm.
and also to stop. They didn't have to continue, but a lot
Mm.
of them wanted to continue because they wanted to get it out there. Also, I was lucky in that because I was working in these communities and I knew a lot of the humanitarian actors. Um, I was able to make referrals if needed. Not necessarily. I don't think I did, or I did only a few. I think for psychological support, because unfortunately it's not present in a lot of communities. But I did other kinds of referrals as well. So, for example, if someone had a sick baby, I was able to connect them with someone who could give medical care. Yeah, if someone was complaining about the borehole in their community not working, I was able to talk to whoever was providing these water and sanitation services. But also because the work that I was doing in communities was really to, this is when I was working with the Center for Civilians in Conflict,
Mhm.
was to get groups of people together to educate them on their rights and
Mm.
also help like facilitate a process where they identified the main protection or security risks and then put in place what they could do about it, right?
Mm.
So whether it's something that they could do themselves or whether there's something that they had to talk to the government or humanitarian agency or the military about. And when they felt uncomfortable to do that, me and my colleagues would do that. So, for example, there were some things that they didn't want to talk to soldiers about,
Mm.
but we, because of our work, we had good relationships with
Mm.
soldiers there. And so we could directly go to the brigade commander and say, we hear that um, soldiers are misusing girls uh,
Mm.
in these IDP camps. We want
Mm.
to inform you so you could do something about it.
Mm.
So I think also, so that this goes back to the point that you were asking earlier about building trust, but also meant that a lot of times the issues that the narrators had were issues that we were already aware of and working
Mm.
on, and we could connect them with other people on their community who were already working on this as well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
that's gone a bit far away from your question about trauma.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, and also I think um, To be honest, the reality is that people were traumatized anyway.
Yeah.
And so talking about what had happened did not necessarily re traumatize them,
Mm.
because I mean, not only had they experienced these traumatic experiences, but they were also living
Mm.
in a place that was still conflict affected, where you still had attacks on their communities, you still had abductions, you were afraid of going to farm because women and girls, they would be abducted or raped, for men and boys, they could be killed. And so they're still living in a traumatic environment. So the
Mhm.
trauma is not in the past. And so it's really about how you cope given that reality. And then also me is how I come in and do a project like this and not make things worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said at the beginning, um, when you were talking about not needing to ask questions that like were further traumatic, you don't need to dig. And I think, as a reader, like I really appreciate that generally, because sometimes I'm reading books about things that have happened and I feel like the level of detail that I'm reading is not necessary for what I need to learn about what's happened. I think there is so much that a person who is putting the book together, or the author, is able to explain something without explaining it. There's so much that you can keep off the page, and there's so much that you can just leave for the reader to
Yeah.
sort of figure out,
Yeah.
just because, and I really appreciate it. Like, a lot of your stories are literally like that I was abducted, I was forced to marry a man, and then a year later I had a baby. Like, okay, we kind of we know what happened. We know she's told us that she didn't want to marry him and she was abducted. She didn't like her husband. We can figure out what happened.
Yes.
And I think that level of, we don't need to go into the level of abuse to understand that it's happened. And yeah, and I think that there can be demands on, generally, like in publishing, but even like on TV, there can be demands on, oh, well, we want to see everything and we want to know everything. But I think if you just use your use your mind a little bit, and just understand what you're being told, it's all there, it's all yeah. And so I really appreciate that sort of, I don't know, preservation of dignity in so many ways as well, without, making somebody talk about things that are really very, very horrific, that they probably don't want to talk about and they can't forget either.
Yes. I did a few years ago, I did a piece of research specifically about sexual violence.
Mm,
And whenever I spoke, because I was also talking to survivors,
mm,
often I would specifically say, you do not need to tell us what
mm.
happened to you, because the purpose of our work is to talk about the services that
Yeah.
you access afterwards. And a lot of the women and girls did talk about the sexual violence they experienced because they wanted to talk about it.
Mm,
But I think also upfront, when you're interviewing people who you know have survived
mm.
like sexual violence, specifically saying at the start, you don't need to talk about this. Um, I think that's also important. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, just to give people permission that they don't need to share
Yeah.
some of the most terrible things that happen to them
Yeah.
unless they want to.
Yeah.
And sometimes
And
they have to.
yeah, and you do, obviously, like, there is a lot of trauma and loss and pain in the book, but there is, like I said, there's so much like resilience and hope, and there's so much strength, and part of that is, like, literally, this is what happened. Like, women have been out here saving their communities, saving their husbands, saving their brothers and their families. They've been doing so much, and people have been doing so much. um but also, when we are talking about loss and pain and suffering, the other side of that still is love and joy and hope, because life continues, and and humans are humans, and families are still existing together.
Mm.
How did you sort of, I don't know, like, manage the two at the same time? There are some stories that are very interesting in the sense that they start off by reflecting on something really awful, or they might start off with like a childhood memory, and then it gets into, well, my friend ran and joined
Mm,
the military, the militant group, and then it will end up on like a hopeful
mhm,
reflection. How did you sort of navigate that, wanting to include both of
mm,
those things without minimizing any of the suffering and without also glorifying resilience? Because we don't want to perpetuate this narrative that, well, if people are resilient, that means that they can deal with it.
mm,
We're not talking about that, but still sort of, holding space for the power and the
mm.
strength of the community that you had met.
Yes. So you're right to say that there is this balance in
Mm,
many, if not all, of the stories. Um, it's not a balance that I had to manage because it's there in people's lives.
mm,
So when you ask people to tell their story on their own terms, they will tell you the
mm,
good and the bad. Um, and conflict, I mean, having worked in conflict zones for so long, conflict brings you up close with the worst in humanity, but also the best in humanity. What people have done to support and care for one another, even complete strangers. So, women who knew that men were being killed, just opening their doors as men were running past and say, come in, and hiding them,
mm,
even though they knew what would have happened to them if
mm,
they had been found out. Or having somebody try to escape, um, and also then hide, like complete strangers, not from their village, they'll never see them again, but say, come stay with me, I'll feed you and your children, and I will tell you the routes to take so you don't come across any checkpoints. um, Soldiers who saw people, I mean, the role of soldiers is very complicated, but also soldiers who saw civilians really struggling and gave them their own personal money, and took them to a refugee camp, and then also transported them to their families. Like, this is not part of their job description.
mm,
Um, and even members of armed opposition groups, there are stories in here of how they people with disabilities, how they said to them, look, you need to leave. And they took them to a place where they could get public transport so that they were able to escape. Or
yeah.
they said to women and children, like, there's this one story in which they talk about how there are some people amongst us who are bad and do violence. They're coming. So you need to leave this community before those ones come. And this is
Mm,
people who are also part of the same group, but recognizing that there are people with bad intent who commit harm to civilians and warning civilians to escape before they come.
yeah.
So and also I think this for me also like breaks down this idea of who's a perpetrator,
Mm,
because of, yeah. Um, so yes, I think conflict brings out the worst and the best in humanity, and the stories reflect that. And it's not really anything that I consciously try to do. Although I think I was very clear in the way that I approach people, that I didn't want them to just tell me the worst things that had happened to them. I wanted them to tell me about their lives. And often, I would ask questions that encourage them to reflect on their friendships and their family lives. Or there's the story of two women who helped each other to escape, and to talk about those bonds, and then that comes out in the story. So
mm,
yeah, I mean, I did try, and in addition to talking about the trauma and the violence, to encourage people to reflect on what was good about their lives.
yeah.
But often that came out anyway without me having to do anything.
Yeah. That sounds so, yeah, just really great overall. Like, I think it just, yeah, just such a testament, I guess, to your whole process in also staying true to the stories that you are telling rather than trying to fit a certain narrative.
Mm.
Um, you could have decided to split the book into different sections and make sure that each section was like very heavily in one sort of narrative. But you didn't do that. You just presented all of the stories, which are very mixed in lots of ways, which is, yeah, just really fascinating to read and to think about and to understand. And you do, like, you talk about, or you write about some people that have joined Boko Haram also. And I thought that was really interesting because, we often see through some of the stories that, this is somebody's like childhood friend that's joined. And at one point, there's one story really early on where the narrator's reflecting and they were like, well, if you'd have asked me before, out of the three of us,
Mm,
who's more likely to have joined the group, I would have said it was me and my other friend. I would never have thought that it was the guy that actually joined. And I thought that was so interesting.
mm,
And I really appreciated sort of what you're encouraging also the readers to understand and to think about is the complexity of what is going on and the complexity of these kind of situations in this form of conflict.
mm,
And that, we often talk about militant groups or wars or governments with very sort of moral binaries, right? This is good and this is bad. And if you join, you're bad. Or if you don't join, that means that you're good. But actually, you could not join and be manipulating people in a million and one other ways. Doesn't still make you good.
mm,
And if you join, but you're completely brainwashed or your circumstances have led you in a position where you have no choice, does that moral sort of label even apply?
mm.
Um, yeah, and I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that, um, sort of breaking down those moral binaries that we do often hear, or we do sometimes even hold ourselves about situations like this and conflicts like this and groups like Boko Haram.
So Boko Haram is a prescribed terrorist organization,
Yeah.
and there are certain ideas about people who are labeled terrorists in
Mm.
the popular imagination.
Mm,
Um, and actually, having met many of these people
mhm.
who are labeled as terrorists, the situation is so much more complex than
Yeah,
that. Many of them joined, they would say willingly, as children. Um, but what is the level of voluntariness if you're 9 years old and your father's a member? Or if you're
yeah,
6 years old and your uncle's a member and he's told you so much about the group and you're just waiting for him to come for you.
yeah.
Um, and even people who are older, teenagers
Mm,
or young adults, um, especially in the early years of the conflict, this was not a group that engaged in widespread violence against civilians. This was
mm,
a group that it started off as a religious movement against corruption, against inequality, and against what people labeled were the evils in society. And of course, this had very particular views around gender specifically, but that resonated within the population. Um, there's one young man in the book who talks about they came how they came to his village and were preaching against the corruption and immorality, the unjust actions of the leaders, but also women's dressing and playing drums.
mm,
And how he was hearing all of these things and he was seeing as a result of their preaching people were changing their behavior.
mm,
And so when people give you an opportunity to join this group and be part of the change, and they say it's all in the name of Allah, what
mm,
can you do but to join them?
mm,
Um, and I think also people have a tendency to think of these groups as perpetrating violence, and they do. And also, they're not the only perpetrators of violence in
yeah,
this context. And I think that also comes out very strongly in The World Was in Our Hands, that from the perspective of civilians living through the violence, you have a number of largely men with weapons who are wreaking havoc on their life. And from the perspective of civilian communities, often the main perpetrator is the military, is the state military. Because often these are people from other parts of the country who don't understand, with whom they can't even speak because they don't share a common language, who come and see everybody in certain areas as the enemy. They see them as Boko Haram members or at the very least sympathizers. and they act accordingly. I mean, that dynamic has changed a little bit, but in the early years of the war, for sure, you had many people who joined these Boko Haram groups to get revenge because the military had killed their brother or had taken their sister or had raped their sister or had taken one of their family members and kept them in detention, and they had no idea what had happened to them. And there was this group who was fighting the military. Um, so it's kind of obvious what would happen. So I think a lot of times people talk about so called terrorists, but they don't actually look at the reasons why they're engaging in these actions. I mean, I'm not saying this to condone what these groups do, because they do create a lot of violence and hardship and displacement for people. And at the same time, I think we need to understand, because this approach of really like this heavy-handed approach that security forces take actually exacerbates the problem rather than
Mm.
tries to solve it. And I think you
Yeah.
need to really understand why they're being drawn to these groups and address the root causes of the conflict and the violence rather than condemn people. Because actually, people in the region are much more understanding. So now you have a dynamic where a lot of people have left the bush and are trying to come back to communities, which, as you can imagine, is very hard to
Yeah.
live with people who've caused you and your family and your neighbors and your community such suffering. But people are trying to do it because they see that as the route to peace.
Mm.
Um, so I think people in Europe are. I always think about the Shamima Begum case.
Mhm.
Um, and the way that Western governments react
Mhm.
to their own citizens, who,
Yeah.
especially in that case, were groomed. Um, and
At the age of 15, I think she was, right? Yeah.
yeah, a 15-year-old girl, like that is
Mm.
child exploitation
Mm.
and child abuse, and no room for return to society. And contrast that with what's happening in places like Northeast Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, Niger, where people have so much more openness and generosity,
Mm.
even though they have suffered so much. I mean, people in the UK, I'm not saying that people haven't suffered, but it's really not comparable.
Yeah.
And then you have governments like the UK government supporting these programs to reintegrate
Mm.
people there, but no possibility in the UK itself. It's um,
But yeah, I mean, I think British opinion aside about Shamima Begum, the issue is still in the hands of the government, right? It's still like a political agenda. It's let's use her as an example so that nobody else joins. But it's still this like, well, this is not because of anything that we've done the as the British government or the British colonial empire for so long. Let's ignore our own colonial history. Let's forget about that, and let's just focus on the fact that this 15-year-old girl made this bad decision to go, right? And this is what happens repeatedly in the West, is this refusal to look at oneself or look at one's history and understand. And because of that, if a state never does it, and then the impacts of that are that people don't fully learn, right? Like only now, I think the school curriculum is changing slightly to include the partition of India and those kind of things. But before, like when I was growing up, there was none of that. I didn't even understand my own family history until very, very recently, because like it wasn't being taught on a on like a big level in any way or in any significant way that was easily accessible. And so yeah, and so that sort of refusal to accept your own history, your own actions, and to understand and to not only understand, but then to explain to others also how this has led to mass destabilization around the world, mass poverty and wars and conflict. Because if you acknowledge it, then then there would be more sympathy or empathy for somebody like Shamima Begum, and to understand that there are a whole range of factors that led to her making that decision that has actually nothing to do with her as a person, and to create empathy for, and to allow her to come home, but it's just not there.
Yeah.
And reading the book as well, like I really felt that so strongly as well, that we need to understand more about colonial legacies, but also just like historical state neglect. Like
Mm.
in the region, when your government has failed you for so long, what are you supposed to do other than try and find a way forward? And
Mm.
when somebody is giving you a glimmer of hope that
Mhm.
join us, we're gonna find a way forward. We're gonna deal with these issues. I
Yes.
can really, I can really see how that comes about. And so for you, I guess, like, what do you really think that, what is the one thing you think that we really need to understand about colonial legacies and state neglect and systemic violence if we're going to be able to approach the world more generally with the sensitivity and empathy that really we should be holding?
I think that the continuity
Mm,
between colonized countries or colonial periods and the present day,
mm,
both in terms of the relationship between the states and the
mm,
people, and specifically the actions of state security forces, um, and also the way that that period of colonization and its continuation or its evolution has affected social relations.
mm,
So, this disconnect between the state and its citizens, this view of the land and its people as being something to exploit for the gain of a few people in power.
yeah.
um, I'm not saying that life was perfect before colonization,
Mm,
um, but I think what it was diverse. You know, there were diverse range of governance arrangements,
mm,
societal arrangements, and what we saw during the period of colonization was this imposition of like a one framework.
yeah.
Um, and so this very extractive of the land, extractive of the people, like putting in like taking over social institutions and political institutions, um, reducing the power of women. We have seen that all across the world. Um, and also this idea of security forces being there to protect the state, whether it's the colonial state or the post-independent state, and its ability to extract resources rather than actually being for the good of the
Mm,
population and really providing human security on the one hand. And on the other hand, this complete change in social relations. I spoke a little bit about gender and the position of women earlier, but I think we also need to look at age hierarchies as well. And so for a long time, there was this social contract between the generations that younger people give older people respect, and older people love and care for younger people and help support them and set them up in life, right? Um, and calling it a social contract makes it sound very transactory,
mm,
but like
mm,
this was a reciprocal relationship.
mm,
But what we saw, especially in the wake of the imposition of structural adjustment programs in many African countries in the 1980s, was a complete change in the economic realities. You had the shrinking state,
mhm,
and so like levels of access to education, healthcare stopped, and
mhm,
so you had over time kind of a decrease in the provision
mm,
of state service and an increase in state surveillance and security force actions to the extent that people the only time they come across the state or the government now is either during elections when politicians come and make promises which they don't keep during campaigns, or the military and the police. Like that is the interaction that people have. And so then of course these are not necessarily positive interactions. So they're going to feel divorced from them. And not only did the structural adjustment programs reduce the services that the state provided, but it also completely changed the economic realities on the ground. Um, so you saw wage stagnation, you saw the cutting of the civil service. You also saw kind of an increase in inequality, increase in corruption. In Nigeria, with the coming of democracy, unfortunately, you also saw a lot of politicians competing for votes, but competing not through their policies, but through mobilizing young people on the ground. Um, and so young people who saw older people as those who should care for them and support them, they would like older people were no longer fulfilling this function, right? Because they saw them as corrupt and interested in only benefiting themselves and their families rather than the wider community, especially local leaders. And so you had kind of a fraying of these intergenerational bonds. And at the same time, older people saw young people, especially younger men, as involved in electoral violence because that was one of the ways that they could get money,
Mm,
and saw them as, because of the high levels of unemployment, saw them as ticking time bombs ready to explode. Um,
mm,
the likelihood that they would be involved in violence, even though the vast majority of young men are never are not involved in violence, have never been involved in violence. So you saw this change as
mm,
well, and you have like so people there are narrators in the book who say things like talking about Boko Haram commanders, saying they were real leaders, they were real elders, and they cared about us in a way that they had not received in their own community. So I just mentioned this because I think a lot of times when we talk about colonial legacies, I mean, it's important to talk about the legacy of that colonial period, but it's also important to talk about the new forms that these unequal power relations, geopolitical power relations, have taken,
mm.
in the form of structural adjustment programs, for example, and the impacts of that, and how that also contributes to conflict and violence today.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I remember speaking to somebody. We were talking about Jamaica and about like the class sort of structure in Jamaica, and just reflecting on how that was so different pre colonization, and actually what it was, the not if you even forget like what sort of happened during the colonial period, just the fact that that class structure remains has led to so much struggle that continues to this current day in Jamaica around sort of social progression and poverty, and even things around language. And I think understanding that it's not just one, like we can think about sort of any sort of government rule as like one thing about, you know, it's about policy, or it's about, I don't know, war, or it's about foreign policy, but it's actually, it permeates into every part of society, which means that it permeates into every part of personal life because the two are not separate. And if you've got it impacting your family structures or your ideas about age and your ideas about generations, like that is massive and is not something that is going to change very quickly. Like that takes ages to overcome that. And that is what sort of gets passed down across generations. So I think that's such a, yeah, just such an interesting point. Um, I want to hear from you about what some of the stories that you found most impactful, that you'd like to share with our listeners. Because I don't want to share too much because I really hope that people will pick up the book. But if there's any that have really stayed with you.
Hmm. I mean, so many of them.
Mm,
Um, and, I spoke about how the process of telling the stories was cathartic for some of the narrators. The process of writing them was cathartic for me.
mm,
And there's one story in the book, actually, that when I wrote it, I was writing it and weeping.
oh,
And every time I went back to it, to edit it, I also would have tears in my eyes,
Mm.
just because it's the story of I don't know if you remember, it's the woman whose teenage daughter was taken, and she
Oh,
tried to rescue her,
yeah.
um, and then escaped with her other child, and then wanted to go back and was prevented from going back and was
Mm.
wondering what had happened to her. And I think for me, like maybe if you read it, it's not the most impactful in the book, but for me, because
Mm.
I know the person, I had worked with her for like for a while before interviewing her for this, and I still remember the emotion that she had and how it had been a few years, but she still missed her daughter and she wished that she could have saved her.
Mm.
Um, so I think that was one story. Another story was the woman who, this is in Niger, her two brothers were taken. And so she went into the bush after them to make sure they were okay. And then once she was there, she managed to find a way to escape. But as she was escaping, she thought, but what about all the people left
Mm.
behind? And she went back.
Mhm.
And over the course of, a number of months, she she engaged in a number of rescue attempts, like helping people escape, taking them to a place of safety, and then kept on going back
Mm.
to rescue more people. So I think that also really, really stays with me. Um, and then the story of one of the older men, and I'm so grateful that I was able to interview these men, um, because unfortunately, since the interview, like they have died. I mean, they were in their 90s, so it was natural. It's the kind of death that you want. It was a natural death in old age.
Mm.
Um, but I think the value of having their stories in the book is really looking at these layers of history, because they reflect on earlier times and earlier insecurity. Um, and the strategies that their ancestors took
Mm.
to evade capture by slave raiders, and how that resonates with what's happening today. And actually, in northeast Nigeria and Cameroon, you have communities using the same hiding places, escape routes that have been used for hundreds of years. Um,
Mm.
and kind of passed down through historical memory. And I think that was
Mm.
very important to have
Yeah.
as well.
Oh, it's amazing. And the title of the book is The World Was in Our Hands, which I think it's such a beautiful and very poetic title. And as you read the book, you realize that the world was or is and was in the hands of these people that were saving themselves and saving their communities. And as you said, people that they didn't know as well as those that they did know. But I feel like the world is in our hands in so many ways. And, this book, but this title is a call to solidarity and it's a call to action that there is so much going on in the world right now that so much of it is not in our hands. So much of it is in the hands of very few, very selfish, very, bizarre people.
Mm,
But actually, so much of it is in our hands in terms of what we consume, in terms of how we show up with our activism, in terms of the language that we use, the people that we vote for.
mm,
Like there are so many ways that a lot of the world is still in our hands. And actually, if we think about history, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, what we're doing today, people like you and I and those listening, it's going to be what we did or what we didn't do that's going to form part of history as well as what the governments are doing. And I wondered if you could end on a note about what we should be doing
mm,
for places, for conflicts like what's happening in the book that you've written, but just generally right now in the world that we're living in.
mm. As you were talking, I was reflecting how even many of the people who are in power, they're in power because we put them in power,
Yeah.
either by our votes or, for
Mm.
example, these men who run big tech companies,
Yeah.
who all of a sudden realize that they don't care about equality anymore. Like they're there because we use their platforms.
Mm.
Like Mark Zuckerberg. Elon Musk. I mean, we buy their products, we use their platforms. Without us, they would not have the money and power and status that they do.
Yeah.
So actually, I
And
think we need
Rupert
to,
Murdoch, yeah.
yeah, we need to recognize our
Yeah.
power. And I think a lot of people at the moment are feeling very hopeless about society and
Mm.
about what's happening in the world. And we have many things to feel hopeless about,
Yeah.
but it's all within our power as well. And the politicians, unfortunately, I see them going towards a direction where they're not taking the action needed on climate change, but they are, or to address the unhappiness and the grievances that are leading to the rise of the far right.
Mm.
Um, but they do have, so they don't have money to address people's economic realities and grievances, but they do have money to spend on weapons,
Yeah.
which by definition makes the world worse. Um, this is, I would have hoped that we were away from these very old ways of thinking. But it's also an opportunity for us, right? It's an opportunity during times of shift and where things are a bit chaotic and you can't make sense of it. These are the moments of transformation. And it's really up to us what we transform to.
Mm.
And I think when we talk about what's happening in the Lake Chad Basin region, which is the focus of the book, um, I would really tell people that what they should do is inform themselves about what's happening beyond their borders, think about what they can do to help. And I really, for people living in Europe, really talk to and influence their politicians about we don't need to increase military spending,
Mm.
that there are other ways. Um, I think for me, that's kind of the number one thing that people do,
Yeah.
people can do, as well as like mobilize politically, as well.
Yeah. That's really inspiring. And I think, reminding ourselves right now of our power
Yes,
is gonna be the thing that's gonna help us keep going.
because the people in the book, um, if you're talking about feeling hopeless, they were living in places which had been taken over by armed groups. They were being attacked by these armed groups, by the military, by their own communities often, but they
Mm.
still found ways to survive. They found ways to get themselves and their families to safety, and they found ways to help others, and really show like what solidarity means in practice.
Mm.
And if people living in such circumstances can do that, why can't we?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. I really hope that this book its finds more readers and its readers. I'm so pleased that it's out in the world. Congratulations. Today is publication day. So but yeah, thank you so much for everything that you're doing and that you've done. But also for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes, for me too.
I hope you loved listening to this episode and found things that will stay with you. I'd love to hear from you, so please do reach out on social media and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review as it can really help.